All right, welcome to my new channel where I want to do my best to attempt to talk about the financial system, the monetary system, and how it works. And it's the hardest part. I put out a video a while back kind of laying out, the way I want to try to explain this subject, because it's really huge. There's so many moving parts that it's really hard to know where to start, because each I guess you could say each topic that each fundamental part of the system can be broken down 50 times itself. I kind of briefly laid out how I wanted different topics that I want to discuss, and I'm going to go ahead and just dive into it. So if you're not aware, we have a fractional reserve system. I briefly went into it on the previous video, if you will. Fractional reserve system means that basically if you were the only customer, you put your money in to a bank, $100, that bank will take 10% of that roughly, and that varies. They'll take that 10% and put it on reserve at the Federal Reserve. Then the Federal Reserve will give them the okay to lend out the other $90 to someone else. So this entire time, you believe your money is at the bank. But the problem is that the $90 that they loaned out to the other customer who didn't have it before takes that and deposits that into their bank. So from your $100, now there is $190 in the system, if you will. And both you and the man that borrowed the $90 deposited that into his bank. You both believe you have money sitting in the bank, but that's not the case. As of right now, we have no reserve requirements, which is terrifying, because I can't remember the last time this happened, at least in my lifetime. They suspended it in March of 2020 last year, and it's still in place today, which means there's absolutely nothing. There's nothing. There's nothing sitting in the bank vaults. So I started, I've been diving into this for several years, and there are many moving parts, as I just briefly talked about. But what you need to understand is, like, we're going to just say, okay, you have a bank here. These are banks, separate banks. We'll say A, B, C, and I hope you can read that. And like I said, I understand it's fairly generic, but I'm going to try. And here I am, me. I put my $100 in, right? The bank will take $10 of that and put it on at the Federal Reserve, which is the bank of the banks. Excuse me. So that leaves $90. So that means the bank has $90 left, but what they're going to do is they're going to take that $90 and they're going to loan it to this gentleman over here for whatever, to buy a boat. Boom, boom, boom. $90. He's going to take that $90 and he's going to deposit that into this bank. So he checks his phone. He looks at it and he says, "Well, I got $90 in the account." This man checks his phone. He said, "I got $100 in the account." But the truth is no. No, there's truly $90 floating around at this point, but it keeps going. This bank will also make money. Banks can't make money just by holding on to your money. They have to loan it out with interest. So here comes another man over here to the side, says, "Hey, I just got married. I want to buy a house. God forbid. But hey, let's just play along, okay?" He comes along and says, "Hey, I need a loan." The bank will take 10% of this, deposit it at the Fed, aka $9, which leaves them $81. They will take up to $81 and loan it to this gentleman here, who will then take it and deposit $81 into his bank. So now, basically what you're starting to see is you can continue breaking this down. That's if there are reserve requirements, 10%, if you will. As of right now, there aren't any. But a disclaimer is that does not mean the banks are going to just loan money willy-nilly, if you will. The banks are not just going to continue to loan money out when they see problems in the economy. They're not going to do it. As bad as people paint banks, and some banks, yes, they have done some pretty shady things. Absolutely. I'm not a fan of banks, but when you really start to go down the rabbit hole, the Federal Reserve is the monster. And we could go back to the Great Depression. The Great Depression, in my opinion, was caused by the Fed, margin lending, and they basically, what the Fed's policies are, affect all the banks that operate underneath it, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and start over, and we're going to just take it back down, forget numbers that I've went over. We're down to banks A, B, and C at this point, right? We're going to take the Fed out. The Fed's supposed to be a silent partner. They're not supposed to be playing around in the economy, if you will. They're supposed to be the bank of the banks. That's it. The Fed is the bank for the banks. The banks are basically selling a product, and that is money, credit, if you will. It's not technically paper money. Most of it's is credit, if you will. But what happens is, say these banks, remember, you put $100 in this bank, right? You deposited $100 in that bank. So basically, this bank is on the hook for $100, right? They do the same scenario I just laid out. Joe Blow comes and borrows 90% of that $100, and he takes and puts $90 in his bank. Which we all know, these banks are not sitting on a damn thing. So what happens is, you basically have a shell game, and then we're going to go over here and we're going to do 81, right? Remember? I hope you can remember the detail I laid out before. So basically, this bank is on the hook to its customers, its liabilities, if you will, for $100. This bank is on the hook to its customer for $90. That's that bank's liability. This bank is on the hook to its customer for $81, which is that bank's liability. But understand, this money in the system does not exist. Basically, this is how the monetary system is expanded, if you will, by commercial credit and commercial, stuff like that. And it gets even more complicated than that, and we'll get into that in other videos. But basically, what happens is, when this bank, when the first person deposited their $100 into Bank A, they sent $10 out, right? So minus $10, that leaves $90, right? Okay, but guess what? They loaned that $90 over to this customer who banks at Bank B. So basically, this bank is sitting on nothing, absolutely nothing. Well, he deposits that. Now this bank can create $81, because remember, 10% of the reserve requirement leaves the bank to the Federal Reserve. They have accounts at the Federal Reserve, if you will. So basically, as you continue going down, these banks don't have a damn thing. Now, of course, there's going to be some money sloshing in and out due to the volume of customers. Now, but you can't explain it on that grand of a scale. So you have to kind of break it down this way, if you will. So basically, what you have is, you have a very small amount of real money that's actually floating around all of these banks. So what they do is they use what they call the repo market. This is the overnight lending right here. This repo market is basically the horse trough that they all are plugged into with open lines of credit. So basically, since this bank, you put your $100 in, they loaned it out, they don't have it. So say you come in and say, I want to withdraw my $100, and this is all microseconds, and all of it's pretty much digital now at this point. You want to withdraw your $100, they can't tell you no. So what do? The bank is either going to take it out of their other customers' deposits, or, we all just try to follow along. And if they don't have it in microseconds, they need to have available credit in the repo market, which is basically a giant toilet bowl of cash. So this repo market is what supplies the liquidity as needed in and out of these banks. It's basically a shell game of how they hide. Think of it like this. On my street, say that you come to me and you say, hey, I need you to hold my money. You're asking me to hold your $100. I'm no problem. Okay, next Friday. Okay, I got you. Well, say the other my neighbor comes over and says, "Hey, can I borrow $100?" I'm like, "No." I mean, well, I tell you what, I'll give you $120 next week if you let me borrow 100. I'm like, okay, he's not coming back, so okay, you know what? Here, right. Well, say dude comes over for that money, I need to be able to have access to pay him back right away. So basically, it's loaning other people your money, but they have to have access to a pool of liquidity to supply themselves in the case of bank runs. And remember, these banks are fluctuating massive amount, trillions of dollars in and out. They said the repo market is, I think, $3 to $4 trillion a day. So basically, when you invest your money, in your little stock portfolios and stuff like that, or maybe you join what they call a money market. That's a whole nother topic I'll get into later, but for shits and giggles, a money market is basically a savings account where you get a higher interest for that. It could be part of your portfolio, if you will. A lot of people, the money market is probably the biggest pool of money available in the whole system. And understand, these banks can represent pensions, hedge funds, investment banks. I mean, it's huge. This whole system is so interconnected. And don't forget, these banks are globally connected. But some of the system that like some of the laws that we operate under do not apply outside the United States. And I'll get into that. It's called the Eurodollar system, and that's an awesome topic. Oh, most people have no clue what the fuck a Eurodollar is. It's basically dollar denominated debt created outside the United States. Like, we have no way to even account for how much it is. It's ridiculous, and that's really where the rabbit hole goes. It's huge. Most people, when they look at the stock market, every day you turn on CNN, you see Dow Jones. And since you hear that, Dow Jones, NASDAQ, S&P, ooh, that's the big money. That's where all the money is. No. The Dow Jones, the stock market, sits on a mountain of what they call the bond market. Bond market. Debt. This bond market is what supports the entire stock market system. Like, people think the stock, like, shouldn't even watch the stock market. You need to watch the bond and the debt market, if you will. Bonds are basically, your dollar is a bond. It's a debt instrument. It's issued by a bank, and it's owed back to that bank because they issued it. It was borrowed into existence. Maybe you didn't borrow it, but somebody did. Your employer borrowed it to pay you. Somebody borrowed it, and down the line, that dollar will eventually end back up at the Federal Reserve, where it came from. A bond is the same thing, only that it's issued from our government, if you will. Our federal government, which is not the Federal Reserve. They issue a bond, which people will give them cash for that bond, but that bond is owed back to the people who bought it in the first place with interest. This is when they talk about national debt. This is how they do it. But that bond is what, the demand for that bond, if that ever collapses, everything's done. People have no clue. Like, we're sitting on freaking, like, I think today, our interest on the 10-year yield was 1.27% on a 10-year. So put it like this. You buy $100, which they don't sell them like this as coupons, that's complicated, but you basically loan the government $100, and you have to wait 10 years to get paid $101.27. Does anyone believe that inflation is not outpacing this for 1 second? No. And as I said, the money markets, where people put their money into money markets, which a lot of people, whether or not if you really think about it, you may be invested and you won't even know it. Your cash is sitting there swirling around this system. Money markets, their interest rates, I don't know what they are. They're not very high, but it's like very small. It's less than inflation. But the money markets, the danger is that interest rates are going so low that the money markets can't make money. It's not worth putting up those trillions of dollars into the money markets to lose money, basically. The counterparty risk and all that, which we'll get into in another video. Basically, the repo market is the plumbing of the entire financial system, for the most part. The repo market is where people go in and out of. They're kind of always plugged into, for the most part. Liquidity or cash is supplied and loaned to these banks from the money markets. Basically, if you have $1 million just sitting there, you're not going to leave it sitting in the bank. You're going to try to invest and make money with it. A lot of people use money markets. It's pretty low risk. Well, not anymore, but this is what a lot of people use, money markets. It's like it's a glorified savings account, but that's where most of the liquidity is supplied. But these banks are supposed to sit on bonds, treasuries. So there's a balance. Like these bonds that are issued by the government are the bank's assets. Remember, banks have liabilities, which is what you deposit. That's a liability to them. They have assets and liabilities. The assets are the bonds that the banks purchase once the government issues debt. So basically, what I'm trying to tell you is if the government stops issuing debt, we're fucked. They have to issue debt. This stupid debt ceiling, it's when I started to dig into this, it really opened me up. You cannot stop growing debt. You cannot do it. This type of system we have, it's impossible. Now you could, but the whole thing collapses. Debt has to be issued to pay yesterday's loans. It's what it is. There's no way around it. The entire system collapses when new credit does not continue to flow. Because apologize. When a dollar is printed into existence from nowhere, $1 from the Federal Reserve, that's where it comes from, a dollar that did not exist before. This dollar is printed. The Fed says, here, you can borrow $1, but you owe us back $1 plus interest. Now, step outside of your mind. You don't consider that if you don't understand this, you don't consider this because you just assume there's so much money flowing around the economy that you don't consider this, but you need to. Pretend that there's no other dollars. No other dollars in the system. The first dollar printed into existence by the Fed. Loaned into existence, but you owe them $1.05. You're like, cool, that sounds great. Well, then you start walking away and you're like, you know what? Well, where the fuck does that 5 cents come from? That extra 5 cents that I owe them back on top, like I owe them $1 plus interest. Where the hell does that interest come from if that's the only dollar in existence? It's a great freaking question. This is where they begin to sell debt to the public. The debt has to grow. Basically, if people are not taking out loans and putting this and depositing, investing, doing new things, basically it needs debt to continue to grow, to supply the money in the economy and to flow through all the channels it needs to flow through to eventually, hopefully, make its way back into your hands so that you can pay that debt back plus interest. So basically that interest doesn't exist. The only way it exists is if someone else takes out a loan. Someone else has to take out a loan and take that and deposit it in their bank, and hopefully somebody borrows it and builds something and maybe you invest. When you start to really break it down, it's pretty freaking scary. It's musical chairs. That's what it is. It's musical chairs. So, when you understand that, you understand that the music can't stop. If it does, it's game over. I'm talking like, you don't even want to know. Deflation is probably worse than inflation. It depends who you ask. A deflation is a collapse. That's where prices go down, but your wages go down. People go bankrupt. It's bad. They're both bad. Inflation and deflation can be both bad. But I'd rather live in a slight inflationary economy than a deflation, because depends on how you prepared, which I'll get into in other videos. But I hope this helps. But understand that the debt system can only be upheld by this repo market, which is supply. Basically, it's like saying that same $100 is supposed to slosh between the banks that owe much more. But as long as everyone doesn't show up but basically if every customer showed up at the bank today, right now, to get their money, it's not only not there, it is fucking nowhere to be. It's so, they're operating on such thin. I mean, I would argue it's probably less than 10% that the banks actually have able, if everyone did a bank run right now and went to the banks to get their money, I don't even think it's 10% that they would have. No, we'll never know. Because they get into securities lending and all that stuff, and I'll get into that in other videos. It's a huge deal. When you start to break this shit down, it's terrifying. You also have what they call a reverse repo market, which is what we're in right now, which is trillions of freaking dollars, where the Fed is sucking liquidity out of the banks. The banks are taking all that money they printed last year, and it's deeper than this. It's hard to explain. They're taking it back out in exchange for treasuries or collateral, bonds, debt, which is driving interest rates lower. Lower interest rates means higher prices on bonds. It's inflationary, or excuse me, it's deflationary. Higher interest rates represent try to stop inflation. So all this inflation they're talking about coming, I don't agree, because interest rates are going down. Because if inflation was coming, people would not be piling into ever decreasing yields on bonds. It's stupid. And I know the Fed's buying some of them, yeah, but 120 billion a month is nothing compared to what's going out. So if the people that have the money, the banks and stuff, really bought into the fact that inflation was coming, and this is controversial, they would never put their hands on a freaking treasury unless they were speculating on it, which is possible too. I'll get into that in another video.